Wamanjika, welcome sisters and brothers to this week's Gospel Reflection. As we begin this week, let us continue to remember our sisters and brothers in the Ukraine and the situation that they're in. Let's hold them up in our prayers and remember to stand with them. We also remember this weekend that our original Sydney chapter, formed in 1971, are gathering for a reunion in Sydney, something that they couldn't do last year, to celebrate their 50 years and the 50 years of our flying of colours. And of course, in the next month in Melbourne, we will be celebrating our 50th anniversary as a chapter, and looking forward to members and families and supporters coming from all around the world to come together for that. I'm Barro, and this week's Gospel Reflection comes from Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 to 13, the call of Matthew. Today on the church calendar is actually the Feast of St. Matthew, which is quite appropriate for today. We know that Matthew is one of the four Gospel writers and also one of Jesus' disciples. He's known as the patron saint of tax collectors and accountants, which is quite ironic because he actually wasn't even the treasurer in Jesus' inner cabinet. That job went to Judas. So today's story is told in all four of the Gospels, and it's the calling of Jesus, by Jesus, to Matthew and his response. And I want to just share some brief thoughts on it today about what it means to us. The passage begins like this. As Jesus was walking along beside the Lake of Galilee, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and immediately followed Jesus. The first thing I want to talk about in relation to today's story is that Jesus is central. He's on the move and he takes the initiative. And that's in contrast to a lot of the other Pharisees and religious leaders of the day. Jesus, of course, was a religious leader. He wasn't the only one. There were many others around. But Jesus, the way he did his practices was very, very different. He went and chose his disciples. Other religious leaders would wait for people to come to them and submit themselves to them and put their CV together and see if they came from the right lineage. But Jesus actually does the opposite. He goes out and chooses his disciples. He picks them. We are told that when Jesus walks with his disciples, that he walks alongside them. In normal Jewish tradition, you could tell the rabbi from his disciples by the way that he walked along, that he would be walking along and that his followers would be walking 12 paces behind out of respect for their leader. Of course, Jesus does it very, very differently. And it's not just in this, but we see it right throughout the gospel practices, that Jesus' ways of leadership were very, very different. So in this story, Jesus is central. It's good to remind it about that it's not about us, that the story is about Jesus. Jesus is the core character in today's story. He's on the move and he approaches Levi. He approaches Matthew. In our 50 years of history with God Squad, we've attempted to keep Jesus central. We don't always get it right, but we need to remember we exist because of Jesus. In today's story, he's central and he's on the move. The second thing I want to say is that it's a call of grace. Jesus calls Matthew. He calls him in the everyday stuff of life. Matthew's collecting taxes. He's not in the church praying. He's not in the synagogue. He's not seeking God's will in his life, but he's doing his everyday job. And it's in his everyday life that Jesus comes to him and calls him to follow. Jesus comes to us in our everyday life as well. Whether we're riding, whether we're at work, with our family, Jesus is constantly calling us to follow him. And of course, for Matthew, being a tax collector, he was seen as unpatriotic as the best, and of course, a traitor at the worst. Because he wasn't just collecting taxes on behalf of the Jewish people, they were going to the Roman, he was seen as a collaborator with the Romans. So the money was going there. So he would not have been a popular person. And of course, Jesus calls him to follow. I can imagine some of the disciples going, "Why are you choosing this guy? Choose anyone else." And of course, we also know that in Jesus' inner cabinet, in his 12, there was Simon the Zealot. These two would have been completely opposed to each other. But yet again, it shows the grace of God, that he chooses people like Matthew. He chooses people like you. He chooses people like me. People who undeserved, people who shouldn't be there, people who don't fit the bill. I often think about if I was God, and I think about that often, but if I was God and I had to choose my way, my people, to change the world, who would I choose? I'd choose people who are leaders, people who are well known, people who have influence. That's what we're told today. But Jesus doesn't do that. He chooses ordinary, everyday people with a heart to transform the world. We see this repeated throughout history, that God often chooses the misfits, the outsider, the least likely to be involved in his purposes, in changing the world. And of course, God's squad's no different. We come from different backgrounds, different cultures, different perspectives, different church traditions, different theological positions. But God calls us all into this body to be part of what it is to be what God's squad is today. And in our best moments, we learn from each other. We meet Jesus in each other, and we need each other to complement who we are, because none of us have it all together on our own. It's an act of grace. None of us are better than each other. None of us are more important. And yet Jesus chooses us, as he did Matthew. Jesus didn't wait for Matthew to be ready to jump through religious hoops, but he came to him when he was in his normal, everyday life. It's a call of grace that the God of the universe comes down to Matthew and meets him where he is in his broken state and says, "Come and follow me." And that's what he continues to do to us today. And of course, in God's squad, we wear this badge, Jesus Christ, friend of the outcast, because we see that that's who Jesus was, Jesus was about. That's who he spent his time with. People who were on the outside, people who didn't fit in, people who were broken, people who were forgotten, people who were excluded. It's an act of grace, and it's a call of grace. And of course, what does this call involve? Let's look at the rest of the passage. Jesus, of course, then went to Matthew's place. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with sinners and tax collectors?" See, Jesus was invited himself, we're not sure exactly. He went to Matthew's place and shared food. In Middle Eastern culture, who you dined with, who you had hospitality with, said a lot about who were your mates, who you were accepted by, who you hung out with. And of course, we see in this story that Jesus once again gets into trouble with the Pharisees for the people that he hung out with, because he wasn't hanging out with the right crowd, according to them. He was meant to be hanging out with those, the class above him, always being upwardly mobile. But Jesus, of course, flips that on his head, as he does so many times. He reverses normal practices by hanging out with the wrong crowd and actually being downwardly mobile. He hangs out with the unlovely and the marginalised and is criticised for it. And of course, this story is one of over 20 stories we have in the Gospels where Jesus runs into conflict with the Pharisees for the people that he hung out with. He touches the sick and makes himself, in theory, unclean because of not observing the right ritual practices. He heals on the Sabbath. He does the wrong thing constantly over and over and over again, according to the legalistic practices of the day. Why does he do it? We're told because as the Son of God, he was led by a sense of love and overwhelming compassion. Are we led by the same today? My mum used to say something to me many years ago. She used to say, you can tell a lot about a person by the people that they hang out with. She used to say that when she especially didn't like the people that I hung out with. And she's right. You can tell a lot about a person. We can tell a lot about Jesus by the sort of people that he hung out with. Who did he spend his time with? Sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, the people who were not included in mainstream society, the people who were excluded. And of course, we find from Jesus that he's more interested in hanging out with people and following them with a sense of love and compassion than he is of following some right ritualistic, legalistic laws that the Pharisees had brought down on him. And it causes conflict over and over and over again. He celebrates with those that don't fit in. He has meals with them, and it gets him into trouble. Often I wonder, do we get it right or do we get it wrong in following Jesus? Who do we hang out with? Are we more worried about our reputation Are we more worried about what other people think of us? Are we more worried about we can't hang out with them because they're the unclean, they're the sinners, they're the wrong people? Who are those people today? Jesus is constantly welcoming the stranger, welcoming the sinner, showing hospitality and love and grace to those people considered to be on the outside. The call for us is to do the same. The passage concludes when Jesus, answering the Pharisees' question that they didn't ask to him, of course, they asked to his disciples. It is the sick who need the doctor, not the healthy. You see, right through Jesus' ministry, he locks horns with the Pharisees. He locks horns with them because of the people that he's hanging out with, to show them that God is about love and grace and inclusion. The Pharisees, of course, were the opposite, and we see this demonstrated over and over and over again. The challenge, of course, for us today is, are we going to be like Jesus or like the Pharisees? Do we offer an open welcome to those who feel like they don't fit in, who are often excluded? Or are we like the Pharisees, putting up all kinds of legalistic rules and regulations, saying, you don't fit, you don't belong, you're doing the wrong thing? It's a good reminder for us as followers of Jesus today to see if we're really on the right track. May we today be filled with welcome and love and compassion as Jesus was. May we accept that today from him, and may we pass that on to others. For we are reminded once again that Jesus came to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable. May we continue to do the same as we walk in his footsteps and attempt to follow him. Amen, and God bless you.